and.org/classroom. Washington Journal continues.
Lenora Fulani, we asked our viewers in the first hour if this story, the Jesse Jackson story, matters. If it's important, is it important to you?
Well, basically, I don't make it my business to give grades to political leaders. I think Reverend Jackson has done some significant things. I also think he's made political errors. The one that I've been critiquing him for 20 years has been going his complete alliance and allegiance with the Democratic Party. So I'm not interested in sort of critiquing the sexual behavior of political people or anybody else and then rating their behavior. I'm not interested in the story. I have not a clue whether it matters. I assume it matters to his family.
John Anderson.
Well, when you say the story, are you talking about the love child, which seems to be on the cover of the National Enquirer, a publication that I don't normally read? And then there's the question, of course, of whether or not there's some irregularities with respect to the taxes that have been paid or have not been paid, as the case may be. It's disappointing whenever a public figure gets the kind of unfavorable attention or publicity that Reverend Jackson has received. I agree with Lenora that he's done many good things over the years, but of course, in this particular instance, marital fidelity is an important American value that ought to be upheld. On the issue of taxes, I would hesitate to render a judgment because it's my understanding that that matter is still under review. And until there's some definitive information available, I wouldn't want to make a judgment one way or the other.
I think I'm more interested in Reverend Jackson's and other political leaders' political fidelity to the American people. If we could get some of that going, we'd be in great shape.
Well, let me ask about this story then, the David Horowitz ad. 10 reasons why reparations for slavery are bad. He sent it to all the college newspapers. Would you have run that ad if you were a college editor?
Well, I believe in free speech. I glanced at the ad, I guess when it first came out. I thought it was mostly provocative. And it's the kind of thing that, you know, it's what we do as politics as opposed to figuring out how to come up with serious solutions. And you know, reparations is something that people have gotten over the years. As I've said in the black community many, many, many times, I believe that our reparations have to come through political power. That's how we're going to go about getting them.
Well, would I have run the ad if I were the editor of a college newspaper? I believe that there's some advertising that is so objectionable that a reputable newspaper or journal should refrain from carrying it. In this case, that kind of ad, it seems to me, only widens the racial divide, doesn't do anything to bring the country together. The question of reparations is one that I think is really so far down the road as far as any actual law being passed to affect it, that I think he's unnecessarily stirring up trouble.
John Anderson, in 1980, received 5.7 million votes for president, 7% of the presidential vote. How did you fund your campaign, 1980?
We funded it mainly with small contributions. When the campaign was over, we had, I believe, 240,000 contributors on various lists, and the average contribution was $23. We had no trouble staying within the limits of the law. The only PAC contribution that I recall receiving, I could be incorrect, but I think the only one was from an organization supporting reproductive rights, which I did very strongly. Other than that, they were small individual contributions.
Lenora Fulani is the first African-American and first woman on all ballots for president in all 50 states. How did you raise your money to run? That was in 1988.
Yes, and again in '92. I had no soft money. It was completely hard. And given that I am a single parent of 2 kids, I'm not a billionaire, so I couldn't fund my own campaign. Basically, dedicated people went out and did a lot of hard work, knocked on doors. We went places that people normally don't do fundraising for political campaigns, and from inner city communities to Indian reservations and just not farming communities. We knocked on the door. I ended up in 1992 having received over 90,000 contributions from the American people who are very fair-minded and supported my right as an independent to be on the ballot. And we had no trouble staying within the law. Actually, my average donation, John, was $25.
Very close.
Yes, it was quite an experience, and it's the way that you bring the American people into politics. It's one of the ways.
White Plains, New York is the first call up to join our conversation this morning with Lenora Fulani and John Anderson.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a question for Mrs. Fulani. This is my first time calling C-SPAN. I've been trying for God knows how long. I have 2 questions for you. I'd like to know what is your take on what occurred during the presidential election, and number 2, why is it that the news media refused to talk about the anti-Semitism due to Joe Lieberman entering the presidential race instead of using this disenfranchisement of minorities?
Well, relative to my take in Florida and the whole situation with the presidential race, basically the two-party system has no way of dealing with ties. I think the most important aspect of what happened in Florida and with that race has to do with the exposing the degree to which our politics are so partisanized. Whether you're talking about the local board of elections, they're divided between Democrats or Republicans, or the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think that it's very important for people to take that partisanization, the 2 parties dividing up our government and controlling our elections very seriously, because that's the source of political corruption in America.
Poto, Oklahoma, Republican line.
Yes, I'd like to put a little twist on the racism issue this morning. I was born and raised in California. I spent 45 years living there. And when it came time for me to retire early, I wanted to find a place that was inexpensive and friendly to live in, and I had relatives in Texas. So I moved to northeast Texas, and I traveled for about 3 years from there, and I finally settled in eastern Oklahoma. And something that I found out when I finally settled in here, and I've lived here for 3 to 4 years now, in California, the N-word, when I was growing up, it wasn't used. I might have heard it once a week or once a month from friends or from kids or somebody that was just talking about something. Here in eastern Oklahoma, as an example in our county, the sheriff's race didn't even have a Republican in the race because he just wouldn't have the support from the community. It's highly democratic.
So, caller, what's your point?
Well, in this part of the country, I'm in serious democratic country. There's Democrats everywhere, and the N-word, I hear it 5 times a day.
Well, I suppose you're complaining about the lack of competition between the parties, and I could sympathize in that regard. I think that our politics today, despite the vast amounts of money that are spent, there's the strange paradox that this last election was the most costly in history, and yet at the same time, when it was over, it left people with a very, very dissatisfied feeling. And not simply because of the closeness of the vote. I, for one, was very unhappy that independents and third-party candidates were not admitted to the national television debates. If there's one thing I wish had happened in the bill that's now on the Senate floor and probably is going to be enacted on Monday, that they had put public financing in that bill subject to the qualification that it meant that candidates, before they received public money, would have to agree to debate any opponent who was on all 50 state ballots. That would have let Mr. Nader into the debates from which he was excluded last year. So I have a great deal of sympathy if your general complaint, as I understand it, is that despite all of the money that pours into politics today, you don't, in many, many races, in many, many areas, have the kind of genuine competition. And that's only going to happen, I think, when we can get into the mix the views of independent and third-party candidates.
Amen. Relative to the N-word, I assume the caller was saying that that's not a good thing. And so he should have set an example for the people in that part of the country. I don't know, write editorials to the newspaper and make it clear that that's something that he doesn't support.
Do you agree with John Anderson about public financing of campaigns?
I do. I support it 100%, and I think that debate inclusion is a real political reform. I must say, however, that when it comes to the McCain-Feingold bill, I don't think that that is an expression of true political reform. I think it's a scam. And I think that it has no relevance, quite frankly, for the independent movement or independent voters.
Now, according to the Washington Post analysis piece by Ruth Marcus and Juliet Alprin, the campaign bill could shift power away from the parties and would benefit outside groups. It says that although the parties would suffer under the new system, political experts say the beneficiaries could be independent groups that have proliferated in recent years to press their agendas on gun control, the environment, abortion, and other issues.
I'm sure I have the support of millions of our viewers this morning who wish that the parties would lose power. As I said earlier, I think that basically what you have with the McCain-Feingold bill is two elements in a monopoly, the Democrats and Republicans, looking and trying to cut campaign costs. They're going to eliminate soft money and restrict this and that. Basically, they're trying to reorganize how it is that they do business in terms of saving dollars. It has absolutely nothing to do with opening up the political process. The parties will stay in control unless we do serious political reform in this country.
Well, I agree that we do need political reform, and in addition to the references to the current campaign reform bill that you mentioned, I saw some comments by party leaders saying that by limiting the amount of soft money, or rather eliminating that loophole in the law that allowed all of that soft money to go to the Republicans and Democrats, that this means the destruction of political parties in this country. It seems to me what it might do is to bring the political parties back to the realization that they ought to begin to act more as service organizations that reach out to the people. I'd like to see some storefront campaigns. I'd like to see the kind of door-to-door canvassing that went on in the first political campaign that I ran way back in 1960. But instead of that, we see the parties using soft money to run simply television ads, and it has a crowding out effect as far as hearing other voices.
Yeah, I guess I just want to caution the American people, because we get, there is this well-known axiom in politics in America that the way the two parties stay in business is by virtue of doing the bidding of special interests on the one hand and ripping off the issues of independence. And to me, that's all that McCain-Feingold is. It's like, you know, Ford and Chrysler coming together and deciding they want to cut their advertising budget, reduce the amount of money they spend. So they do that, but they maintain parity. And that's exactly what the Democrats and Republicans are doing. They are a political monopoly. They will continue to have parity, and more unfortunately, they'll continue to have control over our total political show. And I think that that's what we have to be wary and respond to.
Could I add one more comment to that? I think if you want an open competitive process, you've got to give independent and third-party candidates the opportunity to win office at lower levels. They're not going to ride to fame and fortune by electing a president immediately. Right. I think with instant runoff voting, they'd have a better chance than they have now, and we can get into that if you wish. But my point is that some kind of proportional representation, which is available in most democratic countries today would make it possible for new parties, for independents, to win legislative races, whereas now under our plurality, first-past-the-post system, all of these races, when you stop to think that out of 8,000 seats, if you combine all of the seats in the 50 state legislatures across the country in the Congress, that's about 8,000 legislative races. We only have one state, Vermont, where they elect one independent congressman and 4 or 5 independents to the state legislature. Out of those 8,000 races, you only have literally a half dozen voices other than those of Republicans and Democrats being heard.
Let's get our viewers back involved. Montgomery, Alabama, thanks for holding.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I was listening to both of your guests, and I agree with both of them. The past couple of days, a lot of the topic has been on racism in America, and today you're speaking on political parties, and they both go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. And I figure the only way to eliminate all of it is you're going to have to rewrite the Constitution to eliminate any mention of race, sex, age, creed, national origin, sexual preference. That way you don't have political parties polarizing one people from another. And as far as on a national level, the only thing that should matter is whether or not an individual is a citizen of this country or they're not. If they're a citizen, then you should be guaranteed at least the bounty that this country, produces. And the other thought is that by removing all of those labels, because that tends to keep the citizenry separated, everybody will naturally be based on their merits. And until Congress changes that, or however it gets to be changed, you're going to forever have problems in this country because you got one group fighting against the other one, and you have other groups using one group against another. And
okay, thank you, caller. We got the point.
One of the things that we don't have to change the Constitution to do is to limit the power of political parties in this country, because they're not mentioned in the Constitution. And I think I agree with the caller. I think that the two parties basically play Americans off of each other racially, sexually, however, in order to keep us from coming together and asserting our power as ordinary citizens. But one thing I also wanted to say, I support proportional representation 1,000,000%. That's a true reform. And I was thinking, if people really are concerned about true campaign finance reform, what you have to do, number one, is you have to open up the debate. You have to bring the American people in it. They're not. And you have to give more money to the people who can't win and less money to the people who can. I don't know that much about horse racing, but I know that what you do is you handicap the winners. You put the weight on 2-to-1 shots, not 50-to-1 shots, in order to create a level playing field. And the Democrats and Republicans are never going to do that. We need a level playing field inside of politics. We need real reform. We need initiative and referendum and proportional representation.
Peter,
everything.
Peter, could I add just one word on campaign finance reform? In 1996, the state of Maine adopted the clean money option, where candidates, if they took the pledge that they would not accept private contributions, they were admitted to a fund, or they could draw from a public fund that was established by the state legislature. And since that time, Vermont has done the same thing by legislation. And Massachusetts and Arizona, by initiative, adopted the same program. So I think there are states in the country where people have begun to realize that public financing is the true solution to campaign finance reform.
What restrictions are put on somebody who accepts public money?
Well, there are no restrictions other than that they've got to account for the funds. They've got to be used in a legitimate way.
Could they run negative ads?
There's nothing in the state laws that say that you've got to be very careful about First Amendment rights, right, too, and to try to tailor-make a speech for a candidate simply because he's the recipient of public funds would be setting a very bad precedent. But I think that in Maine, at least, it's working. And what it will do, I believe, is to bring down the cost of campaigns. We've gotten to the point where, particularly on the national level, these contests, there was one House race that cost $9 million. The total amount spent in that district in California between Schiff and Rogan was, I'm told, about $9 million. And that's absolutely, I think, the wrong way to go. So public financing would begin constitutionally to put some limits on spending, because after all, the legislature would have to appropriate the funds from which candidates would draw.
Fort Washington, Maryland, Democratic line.
Hey, how you doing?
Good morning.
One is Miss Fulani.
Hi.
I did see you on C-SPAN, and I was.
It's one of my favorite stations.
Yes, it's pretty cool. One is I was interested in becoming an independent, but I kind of lost interest in you when I saw your speech. It was so right-wing and hardline conservative. You spat out every one of their buzzwords. I was just totally disappointed in you. 2, can someone explain what public financing means? And 3, on the Jesse Jackson issue, I think Mr. Anderson hit it right. Until we have some hardcore, firm, true facts out here, we need to leave that whole deal alone. His personal life, fine. Yeah, you can jump all on that. But all this stuff about him shaking down companies, that is another one of those conservative attacks that they're launching out there. And 4, for these conservatives, the destruction of the Native American society, the enslavement of people, the segregation that went on for 100 years, that was all done in the name of God.
Okay, number 1, right wing.
That's a new one. It's rare that I've been accused of being a right-wing conservative.
You endorsed Pat Buchanan.
Yes, as a leftist, which the media made sure everybody in the world knew. I endorsed Mr. Buchanan because he came to me to ask for my support, and basically what I'm interested in doing and have been doing inside the independent movement for the last 20-some-odd years is building a relationship across the political spectrum between left, center, and right Americans, as well as my interest in building a black and white coalition. I guess I disendorsed, if you will, Pat Buchanan, primarily because he reneged on everything that he promised that he would do and ran a social conservative campaign and got the 15 votes that he deserved off of doing that. But I just wanted to respond to the caller's notion of what's conservative and what's right-wing. For example, I support vouchers. I support school choice, and I'm told that as a black progressive, you're not allowed to do that. It's also the case that most black parents, there was a poll showing that over 80% of the black parents support school choice because the public school system has become such an abomination. And I think we have to stop doing social policy from the vantage point of politicizing these dialogues, and we have to be able to talk about everything. We have free speech. We should use it. I think it's very, very important. That issue doesn't belong to the right or left. It belongs to the American people. In fact, all of these issues do.
Peter, the caller also asked about public finance. To define it, it's simply something that Teddy Roosevelt called for way back in 1907. It means that a campaign is a public function, just as much as a public park and a public highway are supported by public funds. What in heaven's name is wrong with having the government with federal funds support a public function, the choice of our elected representatives and president? So I proposed way back in 1973 with Morris Udall, the late Morris Udall, the public funding partially. We were a little timid. We were going down a new road,
Yes.
and we said at least part of the campaign ought to be financed from public funds. I've come to the conclusion that the only way to proceed now is to do, as I said earlier, what Maine and Massachusetts and Arizona and Vermont have done in state races, and that is to say that taxpayers' funds will be used to pay for elections.
John Anderson was a Republican congressman, member of Congress for 20 years. He ran for president in 1980 as an independent and is currently chairman of the Advisory Council for Public Campaign, president of the Center for Voting and Democracy, and president of the World Federalist Association. Lenora Fulani mentioned her support for vouchers in education. Do you support vouchers?
Well, I think I would support an experimental program. I'm a little concerned that it might drain funds away from public education when there's every reason to believe that certainly in many areas those funds ought to be increased. But on an experimental basis, I might be willing to try it.
Who did you vote for in 2000?
I voted for Ralph Nader. I was consistent with my belief that what this country needs is a new political party. It needs the involvement of independents, particularly when you stop to think that in the first primary, the popular primary that was run last year in the state of New Hampshire, the biggest sector was the independent sector. 44% of all the votes cast, as I recall it, in that primary were cast by people who were independents, not Republicans or Democrats. And today, it's very, very difficult, as both of us know, for independents to get on 50 state ballots and to run for national office, and it's difficult at the state and local level as well. So ballot access laws ought to be changed. It ought to be easier for candidates to petition their way onto the ballot. And then I think public funding is the second point that I would urge.
Bridgeton, New Jersey, Republican line.
Yes, I'd like to address my comments to both your callers, both your guests. The McCain-Feingold amendment has some disturbing trailers hooked onto it, specifically the Wellstorm amendment that seeks to muzzle independent organizations that speak out against political candidates and themselves have no political affiliation. Do you think that the Feingold bill should be passed with such blatantly unconstitutional amendments hooked onto it?
I actually don't care whether the Feingold bill is passed or not, because as I said earlier, I think it's a scam. And I just, in light of that, I wanted to comment on this obsession with getting money out of politics, because what I think the real deal is that we should get politics out of money. And what I mean by that is too many of our decisions on our economy, on who gets money, who gets contracts, who gets to make money, are determined on a political basis. Basically, the Democratic and Republican Party, through politics, determine the distribution of wealth in our country. I know a lot of people like to think that we have a free market economy. We don't. We have a politically controlled economy, a politically controlled market. And I think that's what is something that we have to do something about.
Johnson City, Tennessee. I'm sorry, let's get this call and then you'll have a chance.
I would like to ride to the defense of Paul Wellstone. I know him well enough to know that he would not consciously offer an amendment that would muzzle anyone. He believes in free speech, and I participated in programs with him long enough to know that he acts on that belief. What he was objecting to, I think, was the soft money that was going into issue ads, so-called issue ads, that then mentioned the names of candidates within 60 days of a general election or within 30 days of a primary. Those are thinly disguised efforts to use so-called issue ads in an effort to simply campaign for or against a candidate. And I think there's a legitimate reason to curb that kind of attempt to get around soft money being used to buy elections.
Johnson City, Tennessee, thanks for holding.
Yeah, actually, my question had to do with, you were talking earlier about reparation, and my question is how reparation can be justified if the government did not own slaves. It was actually the citizens who owned. And I just want to know what your all's views were on that.
Well, the government certainly supported slavery. It existed in this country for many, many years, and there obviously have been cases where reparations have been paid to people who have been, to say, unjustly treated or wronged as an expression of slavery doesn't even begin to touch it. I think the real issue is how to create an environment in this country where we can have a dialogue about policy and reparations and anything that we wish to speak about as the American people without it being polarized and used as a political football.
Who did you vote for president in 2000?
John Hagelin.
Philadelphia, good morning.
Good morning, C-SPAN. I'd like to make a comment about the reparations issue. I think that it's an issue that's a feel-good issue for certain people to talk about. Maybe black leaders or whatever they talk about in the news, media, but it doesn't have any chance of ever becoming a reality. It's just a feel-good issue to talk about. I think there's a double-edged sword at work there, though, and I think what it does is talking about this issue and putting it out there, it gives people like Horowitz ammunition to promote this us versus them mentality that the conservatives are so good at. And in the final analysis, it's one of the things that gets us, it causes people like George Bush and Cheney and Ashcroft to get into office. So the reparations issue is actually, it's a double-edged sword. It's something that will never come to fruition, but it will just put people like, well, that's enough anyhow, okay?
I mean, people have the right to speak about whatever it is that they wish to speak about politically and otherwise, and Mr. Horowitz has the right to respond, and to the degree that people find and respond to these responses as obscene, you can't blame the responses on people raising issues in this country. You have the right to do that, and people definitely, the black community has the right to revisit
there is some precedent. We did pay, I think, $20,000 to the Japanese who were interned in relocation camps at the beginning of World War II. So there is some American history of trying to compensate for injuries that have been based on racism, as clearly that was.
Senator Lieberman announced his support yesterday for a cut in the capital gains tax. What do you think about that? What do you think about the tax bill going through Congress right now?
Well, I believe that it's foolish, frankly, to enact a bill based on projections stretching out over a decade over what government surpluses are going to be. We are in the beginnings, perhaps now, of an economic downturn that will literally knock into a cocked hat some of the predictions that have been made and used as a basis for the current tax bill. So I would certainly be of the point of view that we could do something, perhaps, for lower income groups. I certainly believe that those making below $10,000 or I think it's $15,000 a year shouldn't have to pay income taxes. That's barely the poverty age in this country today. And some reduction in rates at the lower end would be called for.
I guess, I mean, I just wanted to comment on Bush's tax bill and join the chorus of many Democrats to say that it's transparently unfair. That said, the issue is not whether or not our government, how much money the government holds on to, or whether or not our citizens get to spend more money. The real issue, once again, is that the American people are not allowed to participate in creating and shaping social policy and spending policy. And this debate going on between the Democrats and Republicans is whether or not, you know, who's the most qualified to set the policy. In my opinion, neither is. That who needs to be included in that debate are the American people. That's not an esoteric idea. It's how a democracy works. And as long as we are not, then we don't have true reform. And these dialogues about taxes and non-taxes are how the Democrats and Republicans amuse themselves. It has very little to do with what's best for the American public.
Peter, could I make one more brief point before we go on to something else? I think back to the primary campaigns for the Democratic nomination, and particularly some of the material that was used by Bill Bradley. Senator Bradley, the figure that he used was that there was about $250 billion in credits and exemptions and favorite treatment being accorded corporations that could be looked to as a source of real tax reform. And I don't see any reform in the current tax proposals of the administration. I believe that if they want to finance a tax cut for the American people, they ought to look at some of these credits and exemptions and special benefits that have even led some of our trading partners around the world to complain to the WTO that we are subsidizing through offshore leasing sales corporations, subsidizing American industry. So let's have some tax reform along with tax relief.
Next call is Phoenix, Arizona, Republican line. Phoenix.
Yes, hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Hi there.
I just had a quick comment about the public financing and how well it works here in Arizona. And the one thing that I keep hearing against it is we don't want the government to pay. You know, there's this weird concept that there's the government and then there's us.
And then there's the people, right?
and I think, yes, Ms. Fulani, you've been referring to this all morning long, that if the country as a whole, we have to realize we are the government. And so for us to help participate in these elections out here makes them not beholden to anyone but the public, and the public is probably a more perfect word than government, because that is us. And if we start to look at it's our government, and what we do with it is what we're making a statement towards. We can use it to our benefit a lot better instead of just fighting it as if it's an us and them. I mean, we're both in the same lake, making the same waves. I mean, we've got to start working in conjunction with each other, and it works wonderful here, and it keeps corruption to a minimum. I know it can still sneak in, but it really. And we had this thing with Symington, and we hold people accountable here.
Thank you, caller.
I just wanted to say congratulations. I also want to add that it's easy to understand why people in our country get confused about who controls the government because the two-party system has so captured our government. They not only control the elections, but they control our government. The Congress is divided into Democrats and Republicans, the subcommittees, the Federal Elections Commission has 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. Wherever you look, they've taken over the governmental apparatus. So we have to get the parties out of the government so that we can know that we, the people, are actually who the government is and works for.
Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, independent line.
Hi. I'm sitting here watching these two folks basically cry over the fact that they can't get their piece of the pie. This is America. You rise and fall based on the effort that you put forth and the issues that you bring forth to the people. If the people thought that what you were saying and what you were portraying was, worthwhile, you'd be in power. And then the second comment, the horse race thing was really ridiculous because after the race, the horse doesn't govern. The second thing is that if you want to change...
Neither do the Democrats and Republicans. That's the very point that I'm making, at least not in our behalf. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, the second point I want to make, and then I'll get off, is that the way to stop campaign, problems is to prosecute those who break the campaign laws. When was the last time we saw anybody do jail time for campaign, getting the illegal money from China? Unbelievable. Using the White House to make phone calls to campaign. Those folks should be in jail. They're not.
Caller.
So why would anybody next stop doing the wrong thing?
Well, I'm sorry. Who's supposed to prosecute these people? Well, one source is the Federal Elections Commission, and they avoided doing that big time in the '96 presidential elections relative to the Democratic and Republican Party presidential candidates. But we're not whining. We're making a statement in behalf of the American people. Millions of Americans are independents, and we're locked out of that process. Somewhere between 30 and 40% of the people in this country consider themselves independents. They can't stand the Democratic and Republican Party. They think it's corrupt. To raise your voice about that is not to whine. It's to do what most Americans want to have done, which is basically to fight to take our government back. And we'd love for you to join us.
Well, I wouldn't take issue with the caller's point that it is disgraceful that more people were not prosecuted for the violation of campaign finance laws, and they should be punished. But the fact remains that in the system that we have now, special interests do set the national agenda. They do decide what kind of environmental laws we're going to get, what kind of tax laws we're going to get. And that is what is really robbing the American people of the democratic right that they ought to enjoy. And as far as just sitting here and crying about not being in office, I can assure you, I don't intend to run for public office again, but I certainly intend to use my voice and I think to try to expand the voice of civil society in this country to express concern over some of the trends that we've decried.
John Anderson, you were in Congress for 20 years as a Republican. Who was the last Republican you voted for president?
Jerry Ford.
In 76?
Yes, Jerry Ford, with whom I served in the leadership back in the 20 years that you referred to.
You also served with George Bush. President Bush, he was in Congress during
He was in Congress briefly and then went on and lost a race for the Senate and later, of course, became involved.
What do you think of the current president?
Well, what do I think of the current president? Certainly he's taken some actions that have disappointed me a great deal, and one that comes very quickly to mind is his quick dismissal of the idea that we ought to pay some attention to the Kyoto Protocol that said we would try to reduce by 5% back to the go back to the 1990 levels of emissions of CO2, and to simply throw that out and say that we shouldn't worry about global warming, that the science isn't good enough to satisfy him, that we ought to make the effort. I found that very disappointing. So there's some things that he has done that I would certainly object to. But he's been in office a little more than 60 days. And I want to be fair. I want to be equitable. I want to try to expand his horizons. I hope very much, however, that the kind of appointment that he has made recently, particularly the one as Assistant Secretary for Arms Control and International Security, a man by the name of John Bolton. John Bolton never saw an international organization that he couldn't love to hate. And to put him in charge of international policy seems to me an egregious mistake. So there's some things that I find disturbing, both in the area of foreign policy. I'm a world federalist. You mentioned that in my introduction. I believe in a strengthened, empowered United Nations. I think that's the only way we're ever going to get world peace through world law. But instead, this administration is talking in terms of a kind of new nationalism, in terms of spending not just $310 billion a year for defense, but increasing that maybe 40 or 50 billion. What we ought to do, I think, is to be looking at other ways and means of exerting American influence on the world scene. Most people think we spend about 20% of the budget on foreign assistance. Actually, we spend 1%. We ought to do more, it seems to me, to support things like the current effort to give the United Nations a police and security force, to intervene in those crises around the world where we don't want to dispatch American troops, and I can sympathize with that feeling, but the world cannot stand idly by and watch the kind of slaughter that took place in Rwanda, that took place in East Timor, in Sierra Leone, and so forth. So I would hope that some of these rather incipient signs of an administration that is going to look inward instead of looking outward to the kind of role that we ought to play in supporting a strong and empowered United Nations. I hope that my fears in that regard will not come to pass.
And we'll ask you the same question after we take this call from Waverly, Ohio. Good morning.
Hi, my name is Judy Jessica from Waverly. You're talking about all of these independent groups. I'd like to know how we would prevent, if we had all of these independent groups and fractionalizing the country, how we would prevent a right-wing extremist such as Adolf Hitler or Slobodan Milosevic, or a left wing like Fidel Castro, from getting in control of our country. I understand what you're saying about, you know, we don't have more variety in our politics, and maybe if we did away with all of the political parties, it would be better than trying to go into an extremist type group such as this.
Well, I support the notion of there not being political parties. I just think we're not at that point yet. In fact, we've built a third party, the largest in New York State, called the Independence Party, which I think of as an anti-party. That said, the American people are already factionalized. The real deal is how we organize ourselves politically so that our concerns are represented and our voice exists in the American body politic, which it currently doesn't. I just wanted to make one statement about unifying the independent movement. I've just initiated, along with a number of other grassroots independents, a petition drive and appeal. Dean Barkley, who's a advisor to Governor Jesse Ventura, Jumangia, who's a key leading gay activist in independent politics, Frank McKay, the chair of the Independence Party, and the Natural Law Party's chair, Kingsley Brooks, are among some of the people who co-initiated this appeal. And basically, we are asking American independents and independent-minded Democrats and Republicans to sign a petition that says the independence movement has got to unify at the grassroots, and we're aiming it at Governor Jesse Ventura, Ross Perot, and Ralph Nader, asking them to perhaps call for a million Independence March sometime this year as a way to bring together all these forces. And for people who want to know more about this, they should call me at 1-800-288-3201, 1-800-288-3201.
3201.
Yes.
800-288-3201.
Or www.cuip.org.
And we have your website up there.
This is what this is an effort that's got to do with reform and the independent movement. We don't have to be taken in by McCain-Feingold. We have real work to do.
Could I get in my plug at this point, Peter?
Go for your commercial.
I set it up for you, John.
Well, thank you very much. The Center for Voting and Democracy, you can find their website at fairvote.org. And they can give you information that I think will dissipate any fear that we're trying to organize an extremist movement. What we are all about is trying to enlarge the opportunities of the American people to see our elections become more democratic and more representative than they now are. And the other number that I would like to leave is WFA.org. That is our website, or it's 1-800-HATE-WAR if you want to telephone us at our Washington office. And we're working on the kind of progressive foreign policy that would be involved in supporting a strengthened, empowered United Nations, leading to the day when we someday hope we can have a truly democratic world federation.
John,
Haymarket, Virginia, Republican, thanks for holding.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my call. I'd like to direct something to Ms. Fulani. I take issue with the hypocrisy that I find in the African-American leadership in this country today. I have two questions that I'd like to ask you in the form of a question, and I'd like to preface it by saying that I think that, as an American, the James Byrd death was a terrible tragedy. And I want to say that up front. The first thing that I want to ask, during the George Bush campaign for president, the NAACP ran that ad. Do you think that ad was okay? Because most of the African-American people that came out in support of that ad are against the death penalty, the very thing that the ad advocated. Second thing that I want to ask Ms. Fulani is, in the entertainment industry and the sports industry, I see every single day African Americans referring to each other as niggers. Why is it okay for them to refer to each other in that manner and not anyone else? And I don't advocate saying that, nor do I condone it. I just think that the hypocrisy that's there needs to be addressed before you ever get to the core issues of what these things are wrong.
Well, I mean, people refer to themselves and to other people in a lot of ways that I don't necessarily support. I don't understand why you're so worked up about that. I don't get it. I feel like we get involved in these dialogues about things that even if we have the answers to them are not going to change much of anything in this country, including race relations. In terms of the NAACP running this ad, it's like the disingenuousness in many ways of Reverend Jackson, the NAACP and the black leadership not caring about real political reform until George Bush's campaign was endangered. And that's why people do respond to leadership, not just black leadership, but Democrats, Republicans across the board, the hypocrisy of all of this, because you can't wait until something hurts, quote, you or your man, and then come out and speak out against it.
Lakeland, Florida, good morning.
Hey, good morning. I really enjoying your two guests, but I'd like to bring some things out about the debate commission and what a fraud that was.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the town hall meeting real quick. Jim Lear was going to pick people out of the audience to ask questions. Well, what they didn't tell you is he chose the questions ahead of time. And if that isn't a fraud, now the question that I would ask, that I'm grateful that Mr. Bush is scrapping all these arms treaties, is if he can do that, we can start funding Social Security by pulling out of the WTO and NAFTA. And what you do is when you have slave labor and child labor bringing goods in, put a 20-30% tariff on and refund Social Security so that we don't have to retire when we're 85.
Caller, who did you vote for in 2000 for president?
Ralph Nader.
Appreciate the call.
Well, I'm happy to hear that our caller voted for Ralph Nader, but I can't, in all honesty, subscribe to his protectionist views. We live in a day and age when globalization is here, whether we like it or not. The trouble is, and I heard this from Tom Friedman as recently as yesterday, say that the trouble is there's nobody driving the train. What we need to do is develop the political institutions now that will give us some governance over relations that are going to continue to be international. We can't retreat behind a Smoot-Hawley tariff. We can't go back to a protectionist mode, but we can protest against what we think are institutions that are undemocratic, that are not meeting the challenge of dealing fairly with labor standards, and I'm wholly sympathetic to that. But let's not think that we can retreat behind high walls of protectionism.
I think the problem with the debate situation is that the only people driving the train are the Democrats and Republicans. The Federal Elections Commission, which postures itself as nonpartisan, is bipartisan. And by the way, if any of them are listening, what they should be doing is, rather than coming up with criteria for minority candidates that's fair, they should come up with criteria that's partial to independents and minority candidates, because that's how you do real reform and open up our process.
What do you think of the NAFTA treaty and the World Trade Organization?
I join with millions of other Americans in opposition to it, primarily because of the top-down control. I never supported NAFTA, and I think more importantly, most Americans don't.
Is today's debate commission the same one that ran the show in 1980?
No, it is not. That was the League of Women Voters, and that was an independent organization. Today, it's chaired by two ex-party chairs.
Right, and they wonder why we think it's partisan.
And I would just say one further quick word, that each of the presidential candidates, Republican and Democrat, got something over $70 million in federal funds for their campaign. Those funds should have been conditioned on an acceptance by them of any other candidate who wanted to debate them, who had his name on a number of ballots sufficient to win a majority in the Electoral College.
Were you in a debate in 1980?
I had one debate with Ronald Reagan in September, but then, of course, Jimmy Carter refused to appear on the platform, and so the last debate was held without me. And I'm convinced today, and always will feel, that the independent and third-party movement would have been advanced 20 years ago, and I would have gotten twice as many votes probably if I had been in that last debate.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Email from Rich Stevenson of Cincinnati. Lenora Fulani, please explain can't vote, can't contribute as the only campaign finance reform acceptable to 80% of the American people. I love you, Lenora. I am on the ballot for Ohio 1 Congress again in 2002. See you at the march. 80 can't vote, can't contribute, and what march?
I don't support can't vote, can't contribute, Richard, but I love you too. It's nice to hear from you. I'm not obsessed with taking money out of politics. We should take politics out of money. And we need to chant that so that we don't get caught up in all of this useless activity that strengthens the Democrats and Republicans. He's talking about the debate that we're calling on. The march that we're calling for the hotshots, Nader, Perot, and Ventura, to call our March on Washington of Independence in the fall and a show of unity of independent.
And that march will happen?
We're in the process of collecting petition signatures, and again, we want hundreds of thousands of Americans to participate and we want to collect 1 million signatures to present to these 3 gentlemen. And basically what we're saying is, hey guys, at the grassroots, we want to come together. There are millions of registered independents, but we don't have any power because we're all over the place. We need to be brought together by our leadership, and this independent appeal is an effort to do that.
Last call for this segment, Durham, North Carolina, Democratic line.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, I just commend both of your guests. I think that the two-party system has gone crazy, out of control. I like Ms. Fulani. I like to say that, at first I thought her support for Pat Buchanan was kind of crazy, but Pat Buchanan was, to me, was like kind of a plug from the far-right Republican, put it in there and destroy the independent party. Also, so far as slave of the reparation question, if the American people would look at what's going on now and stop worrying about what's happened back in the past, they want to apologize to the black people, apologize for the institution of slavery of drug addiction in this country. There's millions of slaves hooked on crack cocaine right now. And that's the American people should be ashamed of and want to reparate for. It's a crying shame what's going on in this country, and then the Democratic Party need to institutionalize reparation for enslaving black people for so long and for leading them along.
Basically, I agree with you in terms of a lot of the outrages that are currently going on in our country, including, for example, the criminal, as I call it, injustice system, which is not working. In many ways, it ends up being a warehouse for poor people. But one thing I wanted to say about Mr. Buchanan, Pat Buchanan wasn't powerful enough to destroy reform. In many ways, the forces inside of the party, some of which were under Mr. Perot's leadership, did that destruction. And I think that Pat Buchanan made a just drastic mistake, because he could have been so much bigger, in fact, if he had reached out beyond his very narrow base and created a coalition between the left and right and black and white people in this country as a populace. He chose not to do that, but the movement goes on. It grows and grows and grows.
Final comment.
Well, I'm not sure where we are at this point.
Well, it's great to be here with you.
But I would simply repeat something I think that I said earlier, that in all of the talk about campaign finance reform, and important as that is, we need basic reform of the electoral process that will make it both more participatory and also more representative, particularly in a year when lines are being drawn for legislative districts all over the country. Instead of having those lines drawn simply to protect incumbents, we ought to have the kind of reapportionment that will enable us to install some kind of proportional representation, so that like-minded people will have some representation, be it at the town council level, the state legislature, or in the Congress.
I lied. I'm going to ask you one final question. In this week's Weekly Standard, Jeffrey Bell's article on campaign finance reform reads, "Campaign finance reform, disliked as it is by conservative leaders, is the one issue that generated large numbers of GOP primary voters, not to mention the big crossover vote. Unless McCain finds a way to diversify his issue mix, he risks being contained by the Bush team as this generation's John Anderson, a man of refreshing style, loved by the press, but much too liberal for Republican primary voters, and with too democratic sounding a message to establish an independent base." And that, along with this picture in the back of the Standard, this is what they say is not a parody. The hard-bitten, skeptical Washington press corps confronts John McCain, and Senator McCain speaking, and the press corps is all laughing and joking. Was that your relationship with the press in 1980?
Well, the press treated me very fairly. There was less interest after the conventions as I slipped in the polls, but I had no complaint, really. And I'm certainly flattered at the comparison with John McCain. I agree that his agenda has to be broader than simply campaign finance, and that if he wants to lead a truly independent kind of movement in this country, at least within the Republican Party, he's going to have to address other issues as well.
I just wanted to say one thing about Mr. McCain. I think he's a nice fellow. He obviously wanted to be president. He thought he had an issue which would help him to win. It didn't help him to win, but in fact, it helped him to make a name for himself, and he's still riding that horse. I just don't want independent voters and independent-minded Americans to feel that they have to get on that horse with him because it's not going anywhere in terms of political reform.
Lenora Fulani, Committee for a United Independent Party, and John Anderson, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having us.
Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon, will be here shortly. We're going to do some articles and open phones prior to that, and we'll be right back.
Join us next Sunday for a tour of the Morgan Library in New York City.